Hello. Good evening. We are starting. So, the Faculty of Architecture, CEPT University, in conjunction with the Royal Institute of British Architects, is delighted to present you with a lecture by Professor David Gloster, who's the Director of Education at RIBA. This event is part of a series of events, so please join us again tomorrow evening at 6:30. There's the President's Medal exhibition, which is in the Piraji Sagra basement. It will be inaugurated tomorrow. And we are very thankful to Greenply Industries, who have kindly sponsored this event. So a little bit about David Gloster. It's not long, and then we'll get on to the lecture. So he joined RIBA as the Director of Education in September 2006, following work as a member of the RIBA validation panel and as an ARB examiner. He studied architecture at the Architectural Association, completed his postgraduate work in the history of technology at Imperial College London. He has extensive practice experience in social housing, transportation, education, and commercial projects, and the restoration of listed buildings both in the UK and Europe. He has worked as an academic for 20 years at the Architectural Association, London South Bank University, where he is visiting professor, the Hoag School in Arnhem, and as a British Council-funded scholar at Hanoi Architecture University, Vietnam. We've had some interactions with him this morning. It's going to be a very interesting session, and we really look forward to this. The title of the lecture is Absence, Architecture, and Omission. So very warm welcome to you, David, and thank you for being here today.
Okay, so far so good. The technology is working. Good evening. As your colleagues have mentioned, I'm David Gloster from the RIBA. The first thing really to say is I'd like to thank CEPT University for their kind invitation to speak at this event. It's always a pleasure for me to return to India and breathe in the great landscapes of this country, which is so wildly varied and always has happy and pleasant surprises. And I think every condition, really, which architectural education is likely to raise can be manifest in the many challenges which this country and region is facing. And I really applaud the university's initiative in talking to the RIBA about a whole range of topics which I believe your university can be in the vanguard of. Discussions like this are a beginning of what I hope is likely to be a very lengthy and productive dialogue. And there's something, I think, unique about Ahmedabad. It's very much the crucible of a number of conversations about architecture, 11 centuries of extraordinary thinking about what architecture can achieve, its social purpose, its civic purpose, its spatial purpose. Now, I made perhaps a slightly perverse decision that I would talk about things that you can't see. So the idea of absence, I'm going to try to elaborate on in terms of the things which you omit from the agenda for architecture. So it's really talking about the presence of invisible or hidden aspects of architecture, and develop this through thinking about the material manifestation of architecture, really the technology and materiality of its making. And also to speak of the unspoken suggests we might be dealing with taboo subjects, and there's something pretty exciting about things which are taboo. And it also seems extremely appropriate that our responsibility as educators is to provoke inquiry. Okay. And in that inquiry, we actually need to acknowledge to those we teach that architecture, when executed as architecture and not just as building, and there is a very, very interesting delineation between the two, that architecture is extremely intricate. Not just in a formal or spatial sense, but in an intellectual sense. And we've arrived at a point in 21st century architecture where commodification of architecture in the globalized economy does actually have quite, oh, okay, that goes backwards. I'll go forwards. Let's try that. The commodification of architecture into the global economy is, sorry, I'm having a problem with my cues here. I'll be with you in a minute. Yes, the commodification of architecture basically, I think, potentially cheapens the impact that it might have in a social and civic sense. And we worry, I think, that the buildings that we love, the ones that we understand as embodying the best qualities of an architect's thinking, might all be behind us. If you look at something with the profundity of Barcelona Cathedral, for example, we know that a building like this is really reflecting the cultural and technological complexity of its time. Embodied in this facade are narratives which suit the society and community which it was built, during which time it was built in, but actually they have eternal values which we treasure today. And looking at, this is the Zurich Mosque, and again, it has an eternal quality. Yes, it presents a theological program, presents a spatial program, but actually, like all great art, it has the ability to appeal beyond either of those issues. Architecture needs to tell a compelling story to successive generations who have been uninvolved with its creation. Those who endorsed this building and paid for it at the time of its creation, they had a particular stake in it. But we all have a stake as citizens in the architecture of our cities. So really, this is a kind of opening fusillade to suggest to all of you here, academics, students, architects, practitioners, that this is a pretty complicated subject. And I think we're signed up to it, all of us involved with architectural education, because it is complex. And it's interpretable on a whole range of different levels. Now, the aspects of architecture that we see, whether it's something like the Kunsthaus in Graz, or buildings much older, the aspects that we can see are very vital. And the Medici Palace, for example, the technology of its ornamentation, the technology of the construction of its plinth, and the rest of its facade, of course, what we see there is vital. And it's really important, I think, that every structure that we make represents part of that contractual relationship we have with the people who are paying for it, the citizens in whose city we're building it. The elements of service which architects have to provide. But in architecture, it is the unspoken and scarcely perceived and barely articulated experiences in space that bind us to sites and buildings in a way that you can't really explain. The great Irish engineer Peter Rice wrote a stunning autobiography called An Engineer Imagines. Peter Rice, as you probably are aware, was the architect who solved all the structural problems of the Sydney Opera House, which in their day were considered to be insoluble. And Peter Rice, and the book's a fantastic read. It reads more like a kind of a thriller than a book about engineering practice. He talks about the feeling when you visit a particularly hallowed place, a place where generations of people have made their presence felt and left visible and invisible evidence of that presence. Gothic cathedrals, many Renaissance palaces and churches have this quality. This is helped, of course, by the fact that these were built of natural materials, but it is something more than that. Some presence which puts you in touch with the building and the past. Animals too have this need to reassure themselves of others who have passed before. They seek the scent of previous occupants. So there's something that draws us to the architecture that matters, because somehow it reflects this idea of the scent of previous occupants, as Rice expresses it. So there's something you could almost say that's biological about the message, the unspoken messages of architecture. It's a primitive, it's an almost biological thing, and it's mediated between landscape and buildings for millennia. It creates powerful phenomenological incident in architecture. And I'll suggest today perhaps that the factor responsible for this is the absence of particular elements or an element. So in this case, when I refer to the unspoken, as I did at the beginning of the lecture, I'm talking about absence. This is an interesting installation. This is the original Bauhaus in Weimar, built by Henri van der Velde, years before, of course, the famous Gropius Bauhaus at Dessau. A good building, not a remarkable building, but completely transformed by the play of light on its surface. Now, this is architecture as event, where the transformation of architecture is by a transient intervention. In other words, it's something that happens for one night, and then the only memory we have of it is actually through photographs or films. So again, it's that quality of remembering the building by an event that's now absent. We perhaps, I would suggest, form our emotional response to architecture by reacting to what isn't there rather than what is. And I'm going to choose three very disparate examples to talk about this. And the first concerns light and its close relation, shadow. A well-known building, Corbusier, the Villa Savoie, of course, and in the five-point plan that Corbusier proposed, he taught one of the stipulations is that you have to flood space with light. Point 4 is the horizontal window. And what does he say? Together with the intermediate ceilings, the supports form rectangular openings in the facade through which light and air enter copiously. Stilted vertical windows consequently disappear, as do unpleasant mullions. In this way, rooms are equably lit from wall to wall. Experiments have shown that a room thus lit has an 8 times stronger illumination. Now, you can only write this, perhaps, from a European perspective. You know, remember, Corbusier's roots are in French-speaking Switzerland, not famed for the strong sunlight which characterizes this country, for example. So the idea of light flooding into space, in his terminology, 8 times stronger illumination, is an environmental consequence which, in this context, would be undesirable. It's, however, as I say, a very Northern European idea where we're used to the persistent absence of sun rather than the more common need, which is about moderating sunlight. The horizontal window is great. It offers you a direct connection with the horizon, and it orchestrates you as an occupant's perception of nature. It's true. The frames of the window capture that natural landscape. And, you know, if you look at one of his more southerly buildings, the monastery at La Tourette, the notion of the mullion, which he is so dismissive of in the 1920s, he's made his peace with the mullion here in the 1950s, and it is a way of actually filtering the view of the landscape in the spaces between buildings. Now, European modernism developed a very sort of feverish affection for light, for engulfing every space with light. And when you see something like the Philip Johnson House from around 1948, there is a price for this, which is a price of the abolition of the private realm. I'm not sure I would be particularly comfortable about sleeping in this bed. I'm not worried about necessarily waking up, you know, with somebody trying to break into my house, but there is a privacy which all of us as human beings desire. So the payoff that you engulf the space with light, light enters copiously, in Corbusier's terms, is at the price of something else entirely. Of course, the reason modernism wanted to flood space with light was a reaction to this kind of interior, the over-elaborated, underlit, shadowy, and extremely brown interior. Lewis Mumford, a wonderful architectural critic, termed the years between the mid-19th century and the early 20th century as the brown decades, when the idea of a murky brown interior with an absence of light prevailed. So, of course, what happened when modernism starts to take a grip in the architect's sensibility, we have a polar opposite reaction to this. Interesting house. This is the Lovell Health House by Richard Neutra. Those of you who've seen the movie LA Confidential will know that a lot of the interior shots were taken in the Lovell Health House. Philip Lovell, Neutra was actually a European from Vienna who emigrated to the States, and he fell in with Dr. Philip Lovell, who was a kind of classic Southern Californian shaman who offered a number of health cures and also ran a newspaper column. And the house was to offer, in Neutra's account, a full dosage of environment, both through inundation of the interior with that Southern Californian sunshine and the provision of external decks for nude sunbathing. So this is the sunbathing deck here, and Neutra's, rather Lovell's patients would come to the house for, no doubt, some invigorating therapy session with Dr. Lovell, and then would tan themselves to a crisp on the sunbathing decks. Now, this is before we understood the issue of ozone and melanoma and so on. The house is actually staging for the idea of the exquisite being. It's all about beautification. It's about the beauty of the self. And it's providing something in abundance, in excess, sunlight in this particular case. And it was, I think, modernism in the obsession, the pursuit of light, is obsessed with disclosure. You want to be able to see into the house because the family that it contains can have no privacy. You need to disclose. This is a very Southern Californian idea. It's a kind of idea of the super shrink engaging with their clients, saying, you have to tell me everything, everything. Flooding a house with light does not eliminate this obsessive self-regard. And if we can imagine that this might have been one of Lovell's patients, quote unquote, we can see what he might have been driving at and why he might have found the sunbathing deck so very attractive. Now, at the other end of this spectrum of abundance, Louis Kahn, a figure obviously relevant to this city, was clear that this promiscuous affection for light was not, in fact, a precondition for great architecture. Now, the work that Kahn has left us is very much a testament to a belief that darkness is the prime condition within space, not lightness. I was fortunate to visit a building which has long lingered in my imagination, the Indian Institute of Management, yesterday. And in a sense, I think all these hunches about Kahn, which is that he works from darkness towards light, as opposed from the other way around, Kahn actually conceived his buildings as defensible entities where swathes of darkness filter and moderate shadow. And he says something very interesting, Kahn. Greek architecture taught me that the column is where light is not, and the space between is where the light is. It is a matter of no light, light, no light, light. That's the way the colonnade works in Kahn's account. And he says a column and the column brings light between them. To make a column which grows out of the wall and which makes its own rhythm of no light, light, no light, light, that is the marvel of the artist. So his concern was about this modulation between the two conditions, the modernist idea of flooding a space with light and his belief that darkness was the prime condition. Of course it is. And he went on to say that a plan of a building should be read like a harmony of spaces in light. Even a space intended to be dark should have just enough light from some mysterious opening to tell us how dark it really is. Each space must be defined by its structure and the character of its natural light. So this is kind of complex stuff, but what Kahn's saying is it's okay to create an architecture that has a powerful uncertainty about it. In other words, it's not a kind of engineering or mathematical problem where there are absolute right and wrong answers. There are elements of ambiguity and uncertainty in the conceptualization and creation of architecture that it's okay to support. The great writer and theorist on architecture, Tony Vidler, suggested that there is a metaphysical dimension to aesthetics. And he said that this was an especially difficult feeling to define precisely. Neither absolute terror nor mild anxiety, the uncanny seemed easier to describe in terms of what it was not, rather than in any essential sense of its own. It was not uniquely identified with the parapsychological, the magical, the hallucinatory, the mystical, and the supernatural. The uncanny revelled in its non-specificity. And this kind of rather atmospheric shot of probably dreadful environmental pollution rather than night falling, it's extremely difficult to know what's going on. And Vidler identified this idea of uncertainty, uncanniness, as having a quality to it. Kahn, in this work where it's playing between light and dark, is prompting a recall of childhood terrors. The choice of this extremely nerve-wracking image for the poster, I think, is an interesting one. It's not even talking about an unpleasant event that's going to happen. It's actually talking about the sense in one's head that something good or not good might happen. We know as children that there are unclear and fearful places that we hesitate to go to, but at the same time must see. And Kahn, in his work, created this through absence, defining surfaces, shape and behaviour within his architecture by omission. So the omission of light creates ambiguity and physical depth in architecture. To give an example, this is the art gallery at Yale that Kahn did, a tetrahedral soffit, in which which is of course both an incredibly strong structure because it's deep and triangulated, but it also became a matrix into which the lighting of the art gallery could be concealed, so that you didn't look at the lights, but you had the presence of light there. So you have both shadow between the struts of the tetrahedron and the inset of light into those tetrahedra. And this is what it looks like looking up. And of course, Kahn, I think, developed this thesis in his work. This is the Phillips Exeter Library. And it's a fortified space. If you look at it on the outside, you will recognise the themes that are there in IIM. This idea of a defensible brick building, a thick wall building, perforated by Euclidean geometries, the circle, the triangle, etc. And also, just a section putting that thought into context. Kahn, of course, developed this idea, I think, in its most complex, manifestation in the parliamentary building in Dhaka. At the same time that modernism in a sort of European interpretation, let's look at Mies van der Rohe, for example, was concerned with thinness, a sort of anorexic thinness, Kahn was building heavy stuff, which was full of contrasts between the light and the shaded. And I think what it was about was that he believed that a sort of architectural treasure could be presented in an ambiguous way. Now, I think Kahn's interest was that he didn't really want a sort of hierarchy of spaces where you had everything leading to one big light space. It was an architecture of solids, big, heavy stuff that was cast out of concrete with very robust textures. Textures so sharp that if you brushed up against it, you would hurt yourself. So different from the idea of the elimination of structure and the elimination of mass. Now, I want to go back a little to pick up some other points. I first saw this plan, incidentally, of the Dhaka complex when I was about 16 or 17, and I was completely intrigued by it. I'm still intrigued by it. I can look at this plan all day, and I can look at the section all day, and it's an extraordinary thing because it relates so strongly to much of the architecture that sits in this country over an 11th century period, in that it is an architecture of depth. It's about mass. It's about a deep and complex facade and about layers of buildings revealing themselves. Okay, now that's certainly one, just to bring that point home, if you look at IIM and then you look at the development of the motifs of IIM and see them in their ultimate form in Dhaka, you realise actually what a complex vocabulary that Kahn is working with. That somehow, initially it looks like squares and circles, it looks extremely simple. But in fact, it has a set of variables which are so brilliantly used that you create these uncertainties. This view can never be the same if you move any 1 meter to the left or 1 meter to the right. It's constantly changing. Now, as I said, I want to go back a little bit and look at some technological histories. If you look at the engineering projects of the 19th century, the viaduct, the reservoir, the embankment, the bridge, the long span structure, those engineering projects for the 19th century defined what we knew then as modernism. That was 19th century modernism. This is the British engineer Brunel, actually English-French, mid-19th century, a complex structure, never seen before, never repeated since, entirely Brunel's conception. And interestingly, the very little engineering calculation can be found following up Brunel's work. An engineer working 150 years ago, more. Very little mathematics, but an incredible amount of engineering intuition. He was asked whether the bridge would work. And he said, well, it's designed to take one locomotive and a train at a time. So how will we test it, Mr. Brunel? We will load the bridge with 2 locomotives and fully loaded trains. Presumably on the basis that if something catastrophic happened, this was just part of the testing process. Tubular steel hoisted into place. I mean, it's hard to imagine this happening in the 1850s. Incredibly complex. This gives you an idea of what the section of this was about. And what's the interesting element in this? Well, the interesting element is actually omission. Rather than it being like the Kahnian concept of mass and heavy structure, this is about leaving air between the struts of the bridge and the great ellipse of the fisheye girder that the bridge is developed from. And Brunel, of course, actually adopted a racing axiom, car racing this is, that one adds speed, and what he meant by speed in this case is efficiency, by losing weight. So you add speed by losing weight. You make something as light as it possibly can, and providing it is stiff in engineering terms, you have a structure which works. To stay with engineering design, I will for a little while. This is the bridge at Salgina by Robert Mayer, an ETH Zurich educated engineer. To understand Mayer, actually, you need to understand that he was also a contractor. He built a series of virtuosic bridges all over Switzerland. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them because they form the canon of reinforced concrete design on a global basis. They are generally in deeply difficult and inhospitable places. And of course, the great gift of this is also about absence. It's about leaving the concrete out of the abutments. Mayer understood that the greatest stress cracking in a bridge was always going to be the abutment where the bridge meets the points of support at the left and right. So what he discovered was that you could leave material out, you added lightness, you added efficiency, and you also eliminated some of the areas where stress cracking would be most pronounced. But as a contractor, he understood something else, which was that you had to build efficiently and to a budget. And of course, you asked the question about how could this possibly be built? We saw the extraordinary difficulty of the salt ash bridge, the idea that you floated a tubular fisheye truss into place and then somehow elevated it. And remember, this is probably men with ropes, okay, elevating it. Well, the magic here, this is from about 1932, something like that. The magic here is very interesting. That is the enabling means for the construction of this bridge. That you construct a surrogate structure, a temporary structure, that you will never see once the bridge has been finished. So the enormity of the task here is that you're building in a gorge, one of the deepest gorges in Switzerland, a timber structure which forms the formwork for a concrete structure. Mayer won his contract by always being able to offer the lowest tender because he understood the technology of construction better than any rival contractor. What made him successful as an engineer and a contractor was understanding the absence of things in the final design. This is obviously clearly absent from the final design. And it's worth looking at other pioneering concrete structures because they too have elements which are absent in the final design. This is the Los Manantiales restaurant in Mexico by Felix Candela. Candela was Spanish, of course, but working in Mexico. And he's gone on record as saying that the great gift to him to be an experimental engineer and contractor was that labor was cheaper in Mexico than Spain, and it encouraged him to experiment with construction technologies. Ferrocemento, which this is made of, is essentially a thin skin, continually reinforced concrete, where the curvature, in addition to the steel reinforcement, adds stiffness. And the interesting thing is here, we have this extremely elegant structure. This is from 1950, something of that order. This is the geometry of it, the fundamental geometry of it, which is a series of hyperbolic paraboloids nested together. But the thing which enables it is actually something extremely simple, extremely low technology. If Ferrocemento is in a way a sort of medium to high technology, the technology of producing the false work is labor intensive and deals with timber. I mean, it's a fascinating opposition between the high technology of the shell and the low technology of the enabling formwork underneath it. Moving a little further on to the 50s to the early 70s, there's a wonderful French engineer called Robert Loricolet. Now, Loricolet was interesting in that he's not well known, but Loricolet actually worked alongside Louis Kahn at the University of Pennsylvania for something like 25 years. So it's an extraordinary idea that in one classroom you could have Lou Kahn, and another classroom you could have Robert Loricolet. They were friends, they understood each other, they occupied very different parts of thinking about architecture. And again, if Kahn is looking at darkness, Loricolet's structures, and there's this extraordinary series of models in the archive at Pennsylvania. Loricolet was concerned, again, with leaving things out. He was obsessed with weight. You know, the famous quotation from Buckminster Fuller to Norman Foster, "Yes, Mr. Foster, but how much do your buildings weigh?" is very much the motivation for Loricolet's work. He said that the aim of the engineer had to be zero weight and infinite span. It weighs nothing, it spans forever. Now, of course, that's obviously impossible. But consider this: if you're trying in your work in this School of Architecture to create the possible, are we going to move architecture forward? So Loricolet is basically saying, no, you have to aim really, really high. If as an engineer you're trying to go for zero weight and infinite span, you know it's impossible, it's a wonderful goal because you'll never succeed, but you will continuously improve your structural engineering design. And Loricolet, and this is a nice quotation, he famously said that the art of structure is where and when to put the holes. So I would characterize this as adding absence. The more absence you add, like the case with Maya, the more efficiency you create. The more efficiency you create, the less your project costs. The less your project costs, the more your client will like it in some respects, providing still, of course, it is a good project. So the idea of absence is actually effective at all kinds of levels. It creates efficiency, it creates value, and it creates elegance. Loricolet started early work as an engineer, working in hydraulic engineering. But as early as 1935, he'd actually developed the principles of corrugated stressed skins. And this led to an innovative sequence of tensegrity structures, which pretty much remain a benchmark for creative structural design. There are political wrangles over who owns the archive at Penn, and this is why you won't necessarily find a huge amount of material about Loricolet online. But he said some interesting things. He said, look how wrong some thinking can be. It was a great mistake, which I realized many years later, to say that the art of building is to build with matchsticks. That if you want to build a light structure, you must use light members, because if you use light members, a group of light members will be light. It took me quite a long time to see that it was just the opposite. It's the art of making a light structure with big, heavy members. And interestingly, another Frenchman took Loricolet up on this challenge. The Unlikely Person of Bernard Tschumi, author of Event Cities 1 and 2, and the architect of the La Villette, and a building which I'm going to actually finish the lecture with. So, in the hands of skilled designers, weight is the enemy of structural engineering. Buckminster Fuller. It's a kind of bad slide, but I've decided that its badness is a virtue. Buckminster Fuller said that solid thinking is comprehensively popular and dominant even over the practical considerations of scientists. Even forming part of the logic of otherwise elegantly self-disciplined nuclear physicists. So Fuller was actually disappointed that scientists couldn't see that solid thinking, in whichever branch of science they were dealing with, was problematic. Fuller's work, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with, I've seen plenty of evidence of it on this campus. Fuller said that actually he wasn't just interested in engineering pragmatism or efficiency, he was interested in the things which we as architects value. He said, when I'm working on a problem, I never think about beauty, but when I've finished, if the solution is not beautiful, I know it is wrong. It's a great quote. And he goes on to talk about the stiffness, the efficiency, the structural integrity of buildings as living in their surface. What does he say? He said that it's probable that men had first hollowed out their log boats. In other words, you make a boat out of a log, you have to sit on it somehow, you're sailing through shark-infested waters, you don't want to dangle your legs outside, you hollow out the middle bit. And then you notice that the more you hollow it out, the easier it is to get the boat in the water. So ultimately, an efficient boat becomes a stressed skin structure. And it's just interesting looking at boat technology here in terms of it being, yes, the solution is beautiful, therefore you know it's right, to paraphrase Fuller. Seeing how that beautiful surface is put together and seeing it on a production information drawing. And he goes on to talk about boats again. He said that after many millennia later, designers began to hollow out their sailing craft's racing spars. I'll just go through this one quickly. I mean, this is a kind of typical Fuller geodesic structure where instead of the normal hexagonal triangulated structure, there's a lot more solid in this, but it is essentially still an adherent to that principle. And in fact, the spar, the hollow spar, is this picture here at the bottom. So you no longer make the mast with a piece of timber that comes from a conveniently tall tree, you make it from an aluminium extrusion. And subverting solid is alive and well. These are projects actually from the MIT Massachusetts Institute of Technology Architecture Workshop. Some of the most productive and prolific structural innovation is actually coming out of this school, I have to say. Anton Gabriel Garcia, the proprietor of the Ensemble studio in Madrid, is a visiting professor at MIT, and they said, do you want an office, Anton? He said, no, I want a car park to build experimental structures in, so they gave him a car park. And if you look at this work, of course, we know that it might have something to do with parametricism. You know, there's a lot of talk about parametricism in schools of architecture. And Patrick Schumacher, you know, one of the main proponents of the parametric agenda, the lead at Zaha Hadid Architects, he said it's a style. I don't believe this for a minute. It's not a style, it's a toolkit. It's a toolkit. It's a series of parameters, hence the name, which you feed into sorting out design problems. And the other thing that you need to remember about the parametric universe is that actually it relates intimately to the classical universe. It deals with geometry, it deals with harmony, it deals with proportion, and it deals with the shifting of those relationships through software. It is actually a reinvention of the rules of classical composition and geometry. And you're free to disagree with that statement, by the way. You're free to disagree with anything, in fact. I always used to say that if you thought I was going on about something and you could feel yourself getting redder and redder and crosser, it's perfectly legitimate to jump to your feet and say rubbish. I'm quite happy. But you can do it at the end or whenever you feel like it. Okay, so we've talked about the absence of light and we've talked about the absence of weight. And you'll be pleased to hear that there's about a page left. Okay, I've no idea how long I've been droning on for, but I'm going to make a final contribution to this thesis by suggesting that actually absence is present in the contemporary architecture project at a scale that we can understand in a building which we might consider, if not admirable, at least extremely interesting. And it's a building which proves to me that architecture can be, still, in the second decade of the 21st century, intellectually grave, culturally relevant, and tectonically elegant. This is actually some of the work of the gent I was just telling you about who has the car park at MIT. But this is the project that I wanted to focus on just to finish the lecture off. It's the Acropolis Museum in Athens by Bernard Tschumi. Built between 2001 and 2009, so not minty fresh, but, you know, 7 years, that's okay in the historical continuum. One of the most contentious possible projects, because you're building on the Acropolis, which routinely, if you open up accounts of architecture, whether they're Western or non-Western, very often it starts to be there on page one as, you know, some kind of paradigm. We're not going to discuss whether it is or not, but if you're building in a archaeologically challenging environment, how the hell do you go about doing it without upsetting everybody? The museum is not, of course, at the top of the Acropolis. It's on the lower slopes of the Temple Mound. And of course, interestingly, as is the case with all the great sites in the world, the archaeology is piled up layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, because underneath this city there's another layer of a city, and underneath that layer there's another city, and underneath that layer there's another city. We only build in places which we instinctively feel are auspicious, and that's the reason why the Acropolis, of course, was built on multiply over many millennia. But of course, all this geology was just stuck under the surface of the site. So Tschumi was kind of aware that the one thing you didn't do was start jumping all over the site, wearing size 10 shoes, as it were. You had to do something that was significantly more sensitive and which encapsulated that archaeology. And if you look at this slide here, what he actually did, the very first act is actually an archaeological act. It is about digging down through the layers of the archaeology to reveal them. The second is then finding a structural program which somehow kind of tiptoes between them. You know, you've had a party and all your friends are asleep on the floor, and you want to go to the kitchen to make a cup of tea or coffee, and they're all asleep on the floor all over your house, and you have to kind of tiptoe between them. That was actually the structural task which this building set out to deal with. So he started with this, you know, idea of an archaeology which was absent. It had been omitted from any previous consideration about how you made this museum. And the history of the Acropolis Museum is that it's been run as a competition at least twice, to my certain knowledge, before anything was actually built. We all know the other thing about the Acropolis, which is that, of course, like many extraordinary sites, historical sites throughout the world, the British have been. And what happens when the British come? They take things away. So it's a story familiar to all of you in India, the appropriation of cultural artifacts, and then they take them back home, don't they, to London, and they say, we're going to keep them safe in the British Museum. So, of course, the absent element in on the Acropolis is what's known collectively in the British Museum as the Elgin marbles. And that's kind of an interesting thing because, of course, they were taken away between 1802 and 1812 by Lord Elgin. who said, well, the Ottomans are currently in charge of Athens. We don't think that they're sympathetic to these architectural treasures, so I'll just take them back to London, if you don't mind, where we can look after them. Clearly, Greece is no longer ruled by the Ottoman Empire, so there's no real excuse for not giving them back. The British, of course, have invented all kinds of flimsy excuses to not return them. So the Greeks had a problem. How do you curate the museum from something that's absent? And there's quite a lot of it. Friezes, pediment sculptures, fragmented statues from the cellar, a column, a capital, blocks of crown moulding, including architraves and cornices, and a caryatid, one of those extraordinary Amazonian goddesses holding up a lintel. So he thought, Elgin thought, that the destruction of the Parthenon was imminent and therefore selectively ransacked it. So the museum, of course, has got to worry about, how are you going to include these things? And this process of cultural appropriation is something that's a global phenomenon. I'm not going to get into the politics of it. There is no current will to return the Elgin marbles to the Parthenon. So what does the museum also have to talk about? It also has to talk about this absence. And here's an interesting review of the building when it opened. And so to the final purpose of this new museum, cultural propaganda. The greatest weakness in the Greeks' case to retrieve the marbles from Britain was always the lack of a suitable museum in which to put them. Tschumi's museum is the strongest card the Greeks have yet played. There's an interesting thought. Elgin said that the Ottomans were going to blow up the Parthenon. The previous governments of the UK have said there's too much atmospheric pollution in Athens, we don't want to give them back and for them to be destroyed by emissions. Now there's a museum-grade environment, self-evidently, in which those artifacts can be safely stored. So Tschumi's museum is really contrived around a condition which is invisible or partially absent, and it also commiserates the absence of its most precious treasures. But there is finally another interesting thing, that if you look at the Parthenon and all the buildings on the Acropolis, they're all about mass. They're all about this light, no light, light, no light thing that I started with Kahn. So the instinct perhaps is to make a building of mass. And so Tschumi chooses to do the exact opposite. Glass is the key element, not just in the facade, reflecting the Parthenon back to the viewer, but actually internally. And glass, as we know, I mean, this is the large glass by Marcel Duchamp, which I put in there actually almost gratuitously, but glass has got a kind of metaphysical property. To digress a little, when glass technology was first developed, it was developed all over the world, but I mean, I'll tell you a story about glass blowing in Italy, actually specifically in Murano, near Venice. There was a colony of glass blowers outside Murano. Glass blowing was such a secretive art that if you left the colony without permission and they caught you, the penalty was death. So the craft of glass blowing was thought to be so extraordinary and esoteric that it was protected in a sort of guild structure. And there's also something about glass. I mean, this is a wholly different building, the Kanagawa Institute of Technology in Japan. And I've put it in for an interesting reason, because it goes back to the Philip Johnson house. A white house with great glass windows surrounded by trees becomes almost transparent when the sun shines. The white walls act as projection screens on which shadows multiply the trees, and the glass plates become mirrors in which trees are repeated. A perfect transparency is the result. The house becomes a part of nature. So part of the reasoning, I think, Moholy-Nagy, the art theorist, wrote that, by the way, and artist. So part of the thing about glass in the Acropolis Museum is about making something disappear. So the building has an instinct to be invisible. And it achieves that in a number of ways, in the facades and also the glazed floors. You look through the floor and down to the datum of the archaeology. It's a perfect counterpoint to the mass of the landscape on which the Acropolis is built and the Parthenon itself. And actually, in doing so, by making itself as invisible as it is possible for a heavy building to be, it draws attention to the secular nature of the site as well as its sacred nature. So I guess, in terms of telling students of architecture that what they have to do is leave stuff out, that might seem like a really poor idea. Because, of course, what we as academics are trying to do is encourage you to produce, not to leave stuff out. But it's a bit stronger than that and a bit more important. We know that the planet is warming. We know that there are going to be battles about food and water. We know that the civic space is contested in every city. So we could say, well, okay, these are the really big arguments, and of course they are. But the real problems of architecture actually elude any standard set of arguments. They're so complicated, they're so deep, they're so layered that you can't reduce the development of architecture to a set of metrics, to a set of parameters. I talked about commodification. I showed that slightly depressing image of Shanghai, where there are something like 300 buildings, 350 buildings above 55 stories, so that even the idea of the tall building is diminished by an excess of tallness. Architecture, I would argue, it's kind of facing something of an existential crisis, because the closer we get it to business, the bigger problem we have. The more it becomes like building, and the less it becomes like architecture. Very few projects, I think, which are published have a kind of pedagogical justification, and the narratives which a building like the Acropolis Museum supports are very often absent. And not absent in a good way. Everything you do as architects and designers has to have meaning. It has to have meaning not just to you, not just to your peer group, not just to your tutors, but actually to the community and world at large. The average life of a building, I know, in London is around 80 to 90 years. I don't know what it is in Ahmedabad, possibly the same, possibly more. But the obligation we create when we make the building, when we make architecture, is not confined to our lifetime. So yes, it's absolutely true that our graduates from schools of architecture should be employable, and that they know that resource efficiency and sustainability includes respect for handling other people's money and their time. And of course they need to learn that mastery of software is not the same as mastery of architecture. Mastery of software is simply mastery of tools. But you will need to know that design into production, the transcending of the digital software into digital fabrication, is going to be an issue in your lifetimes. Actually, in the next 5 to 10 years. We see the depressing spectacle on YouTube of 38-story buildings constructed in China from 3D printing in 30 days. Not architecture. It's just production. So absence actually serves a purpose. It tells the emergent architect to know what can be inferred and what should be left out and what's ultimately important. You have to have a bit of self-restraint. It's kind of fundamental to being an architect. And I'm going to close on an unlikely quotation from an unlikely source. Those of you who know the Kill Bill movies by Tarantino will know that Uma Thurman, dressed in a suit for the big fight scenes that mirrored Bruce Lee's movies from the 1970s. But Bruce Lee was, of course, not just a martial arts expert, he was also a philosopher. And in his books, he writes very interesting things. He said, I'm getting very near the end, you'll be relieved to hear, art reaches its greatest peak when devoid of self-consciousness. Freedom discovers man the moment he loses concern over what impression he's making or is about to make. So in other words, when we make architecture, we have to set ourselves aside. We achieve architecture when the self is absent. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank David for a very remarkable lecture, which seems to me to encourage us all to, through this examination of absence and omission, to, in a sense, defer gratification. And that much of the architecture that we see now is the conversion of money into commodity. Pile it high, stack it up, and sell it. So I think it's a really pertinent conversation to have in the situation that we're in now. And I would like to invite you all to ask questions or to make some observations about the lecture.
I don't cry easily, so please be as critical as you like.
Who would like to ask a question? I've got the magic mic. I think the idea that we leave things out is a sophisticated idea for designers, because I think when one begins to design as a young designer, there's a tendency to do more and more and more. And actually what you're talking about is the maturity to begin to consider alternative tactics. So what do you all think about this strategy of omission and absence? Is it doable? Can you see it working in your projects? Can you see the benefits that might come from this approach?
Because, you know, you get to that point in a tutorial with your tutor, and the tutor says, well, this idea maybe is stronger than that idea. And, you know, you've had 2, 3 ideas, and actually you're thinking, these ideas are like my intellectual children. I can't choose between them. I don't want to leave one at home. But actually, in the process of making better design, you always have to abandon stuff. But is that a difficult choice to make?
Anyone? Srivatsan, here.
You know, I'm not sure if you could take absence in a very literal sense and say the absence itself will produce that rich experiential thing. For instance, the last building that you showed, not the last, the one before that, the Japanese Institute, is in a literal sense transparent, in a sense that it's literally absent, the facade. But that, but for your words, otherwise I would have possibly seen as a little very blank, anemic kind of a building. While the kind of absence that you showed in the earlier buildings was not just literal. So there is something, a distinction to be made between a literal absence, or put it the other way, when the literal absence produces a phenomenologically rich experience, is where the success of the absence can be acknowledged. The literal absence itself is not any guarantee.
No, I completely agree. I mean, really, I think the purpose with any presentation is actually provocation. And I don't mean that in a sort of aggressive sense. I think you can talk about absence as being less emphasis on something and more emphasis on something else. So it might not necessarily mean you're leaving some quality out. You're downplaying it, so that if you've got a hierarchy of decisions, you say, okay, that one is less important than another one, and that one perhaps is more important still. So it's a question of emphasis. But I think it is, you know, I think Mary Jane's point about restraint and a sort of a refusal not to be gratified, I think is quite important. And if you look at really the best work, it's absolutely clear that people have other ideas or alternative options they could have pursued and have chosen not to. And it's not something that I think immediately sits with you at the beginning of a professional career. You want to put everything in. And my view is it's kind of like putting gas in the tank when you set off on a long journey. You need to have plenty of gas in the tank as an architect because your professional career will be long. So make sure there's enough gas in the tank for about 50 years, guys, because that's how long you're going to be doing this crazy subject.
Is there another question?
Hi. Sorry. I just want clarification on this last part about art reaches its greatest peak when it's devoid, when devoid of self-consciousness. And I just want a little elaboration on that when you design projects or when you design buildings or architecture for that matter, do you leave the self out, or how does that?
I think you have to put enough of yourself in to be creative.
Absolutely.
But the important thing is that the creation of a project, the development of a project, actually is the result of a number of people having a conversation. You cannot have an architectural project without a site. The site is like a kind of silent partner. You cannot have an architectural project without a patron, because you need somebody to pay for it, whether we like it or not. You cannot execute the project without a contractor. So the fact is you have multiple parties to the conversation. So you need enough ego and creativity and imagination to get the project developed. At that point, it comes into the public realm. It starts to become this conversation between lots and lots of different people. At that point, you have to kind of say, okay, we're trying to work to a shared good at this point. We can't have too much of me in this, otherwise we're not actually creating the project which everybody can share. So again, it's a question of emphasis. And Bruce Lee's point was that actually it wasn't him, in a sense, who was the fighter, the martial artist. It was a kind of mindset that simply made him the instrument of everything that he did physically. This is kind of stuff which I don't think is particularly straightforward. You can't actually put a number on it, but I think the interesting thing about the architectural heritage of this country in particular is it's deep with meaning. Every single building has an iconography over the many centuries of architectural development here, and the challenge is how you keep the qualities of depth and narrative and iconography going in an age where everything is wanted yesterday.
Yeah.
It's interesting, this point about self-consciousness that you brought up. You use the word ego, and I think most of the star architects, I don't know how many would agree with me, but it's not about losing their self-consciousness, but actually having it.
Okay. I think that's a fair point. No. I think it's a really good observation. None of us would be in this room. None of us would be embarking on studies as architects or practicing as architects or teaching architecture unless we had that motivation in the first place. The point is about when you learning how to park it, and that can be difficult because. One of the paradoxes about architectural education, we're educated as individuals, and yet in professional life we have to work in teams. So the individual has to meet collegiate behaviour in the professional context. That's a pretty tough transition to make. And so I'm kind of sort of firing a few warning shots, saying, well, there are two worlds, and this is one of the fascinating things with architecture. There's the world of academic education, which rightly has to have its own integrity and ability to call its own shots. And there's a world out there which is pretty pragmatic. It's about time and money and deadlines and, when can I have my building? The heating isn't working, how do I make it work, etc., etc. So it's really, in a way, what I'm saying is, how do we negotiate these things to get something that's worthwhile out of it?
So usually...
There are many approaches. This is just one.
Okay. Are there any more questions? One here.
Hi, thank you, David, for a fascinating spectrum. I'm just wondering, given your background and given what you've seen, because you've probably been in 60 schools of architecture around the world, and the point that you raised about where to next. So the idea of absence, which is, I guess, is thoroughly modern, and the idea of the pragmatics of architecture, which you've talked a lot about. And also, given that we've got Archipre coming here in a couple of months' time, and we've got your exhibition here, what have you seen, or what have you taken away from your travels across many schools of architecture in response to the question, where to next?
It's a great question, thank you, Owen. I think, interestingly, it doesn't matter where you are geographically or culturally. Actually, I think a lot of the issues are the same. You know, we live. The economy is globalized, but actually, to a certain extent, the sort of intellectual processes are globalized thanks to the internet. This makes it quite difficult because it means that an idea that's been generated in Mexico can be replicated in Malaya the next day without understanding why you generated that idea. So I think we have to, where to next? I think we need to build a bridge between craft, which is analog craft, and digital craft, design into production, in a way that actually gives architecture back to the constructed process. I mean, one of the themes I think is very interesting is, can we redefine models for practice? Not to eliminate the multinational global practice that might be multidisciplinary, but to start to develop a model for practice where we become not just architects, but also constructors. I think there's something extremely interesting in that. And you know, I think about projects like the projects that Anna Herring has executed in Bangladesh, where the architect becomes re-embedded in the community with the people who actually know how to make buildings. They understand the technologies of brick, they understand the technologies of wood and steel and so on. I think that the divorce between the constructed process and the design and design production information process is problematic. I mean, if you look at the Japanese model, I think 90% of architecture graduates work for construction companies. So the connection between architecture and construction is much more intimate. It's not to say that every building in Japan, you know, is supremely beautiful, but I've often found myself standing outside buildings in Tokyo or Yokohama wondering which iconic architect has produced them, only to find they've been produced by a construction company. I think there's a way of, I think we need to take the architect, embed them back into the community with construction skills, and actually develop a much more community-developed appropriation of architecture, land, and the construction process. That is an extremely political idea. But I think taking architecture out of the process of commodity and business has to be one way forward. I think there are many ways forward. You know, you know, I know people who've graduated and have gone to Norman Foster's office and think they've died and gone to architect heaven, and other people who quite literally have given up architecture as a result of that experience. So the reality is that we have to have lots of models, but I think the schools are great at, you know, posing provocative questions to students, but I'd kind of like to turn it around and say, well, how would the profession wish to redefine itself in a way that's got perhaps more social purpose? There's a provocative thought.
Do you think the idea of absence is actually a universally accepted virtue for excellence? Or is it just a part of architecture that is already there and is just being highlighted?
I don't think a building has to exclusively exhibit absence. I mean, if we were looking at the Zurich Mosque, we were looking at Barcelona Cathedral, we were looking at the Medici Palace, I don't think there's absence in any of those buildings. They're kind of like a cake that's been iced, and then they decided to ice it again just to make sure it was iced. We can enjoy that. We can enjoy that abundance, that kind of excess as well. There are no real rules about it. This is what I was trying to do tonight is to say there are different trajectories we can take for design, and everybody who's studying architecture has to define a personal design methodology. That's the thing that makes us architects.
Do you not feel that there's an element of absence or a play of absence in any architecture, even in those cases?
There are certain things that their designers have chosen not to do. And if that being the case, yes, there's absence in everything. I'm probably talking about it in a more self-conscious way.
Thank you. Mr. Trevatson, anybody else? I suppose one of the questions I've got, just to sort of maybe, is really this search for meaning that you've alluded to in architecture. And we're now, if you look at Louis Kahn, I understand he was Jewish, the tremendous tradition, and certainly in India, of temples and a sacred spiritual approach to life. But I'm also aware that in many countries now, there's a complete absence of any of those experiences. So for young architects studying architecture, how important do you think it is for people to go out and directly seek experiences through actually being in architecture and trying to understand what has meaning?
It's a really good point. When we're in a school of architecture, very often one of the last things we do is experience it in a direct sense. And going back to the quote at the beginning from Peter Rice, where he was talking about, we seek these places that have this kind of resonance. I think everybody has an obligation to educate themselves, and I don't mean that in a patronising way at all, through immersion in architecture firsthand. I think that's the way that we make our choices about what we will embrace as designers. From seeing the Indian Institute of Management and one of the two great Corbusier houses in Ahmedabad firsthand yesterday, my understanding of them is completely transcended from what it was from when I was an 18-year-old. So immersing yourself in this stuff is absolutely fundamental. So first rule of architectural education, get out of the house.
Are there any other observations or questions?
You've all been absolutely delightfully patient, and thank you very much for the questions, and thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, David. Give me a round of applause. And can I just say one thing? I would really like to thank our sponsors tonight, because without our sponsors, we wouldn't have had the joy of having David here. And this event, part of the President's Medals exhibition, is generously sponsored by Greenply Industries Limited. Thank you very much.